Welcome to Storyteller's Archive, where your story gains voice. In this video, Hunting Season by Dr. Rockhard. Chapter 23. Long Gone. Adira's jaw trembled at the sight of the bodies scattered before her. She swallowed heavily as two swung from the tree branches, disemboweled and pale, while the other three were sprawled in different directions. God stepped over one, reaching up to untangle a young male from the tree. Adira couldn't contain herself. She cried out, covering her face as she fell to the floor in an attempt to hide. God turned behind him, observing the cowering woman with an agitated sigh.
If you think I did this, you're wrong.
Adira shakily uncovered one eye, trying to avoid the mutilated corpse dangling from God's grip. She didn't believe him, which he knew. Casually, he dug his hand inside the corpse's cold chest, fumbling with the human's organs. Adira covered her ears, breathing heavily until she felt it was all over. God was now holding what appeared to be a heart. He dropped the body on the floor and made his way over to the side of a tree. Adira didn't want to know what he was up to, nor did she ask. She stayed paralyzed as she examined him squeezing the organs in his hands, dripping the cold blood over a familiar-looking pile of rocks. On top sat a little effigy, the one with horns she once saw a while back.
They were all hanging from the branches when I arrived. I never felt or saw who did this.
Adira chewed on her lower lip as she shakily glanced around her. She took note of visible signs of struggle and more strange rock monuments covered in blood. It was hard to believe God hadn't done it, especially after he was further vandalizing the bodies. How do I know it wasn't you? You're ripping out there. She couldn't finish and threw her hands up to her mouth to suppress a gag. God stood up, motioning around him.
I believe in the old saying, an eye for an eye. There's no reason for me to kill these mortals unless they harm my forest. I offer the blood of those slain to a much higher being, one who hungers for the flesh of men. Whether it is done by me or not, a human sacrifice will always be offered.
Adira felt her skin crawl at the mention of something worse than God being out there. It made her wonder what other monstrosities plagued the world. Then you don't know who killed them? Adira felt sick with fear. What if it's your freaky cult people or a bear?
Those women are insane, but this is beyond them. As for an animal, don't be stupid.
Adira turned her back to God, her chest rising and falling rapidly. So this is what you wanted me to see? A slaughter and a sacrificial offering to God knows what? Is that how the rest of my miserable life will be? God took his time plucking the last body of the branches overhead, repeating his practice while he made sure Adira was still turned away. As soon as he was finished, he licked the blood off his hands and made his way over to the woman. She jumped when he laid his hand on her shoulder, which in turn made him let go.
You say you found your people. I can also assume your little boyfriend's still missing.
Adira has almost forgotten. I did. Please help me get them out of here. Mitch is still missing, but once we find him, I will keep my promise. I can't give up now. God was once again amused, and bent down to get a better look at Adira's face.
Once you spend a couple nights with me, I'm sure you'll be looking at the world a little differently. Miserable is far from it.
Adira sneered at the beast, not even attempting to hide her disgust. Don't think you can brainwash me like you did with your creepy cult.
I don't need to.
I don't like your tone. Adira spat back venomously, fuming as her cheeks flushed red. She started to march down the path, ignoring what could only be described as sick, distorted laughter behind her. She continued walking as God trailed after her, both of them heading for Kevin and Conrad's camp. Adira hoped the men wouldn't be too afraid, and that God wouldn't do anything stupid. She feared something would go wrong, and with a quiet sigh stopped walking, just as they were less than a mile away. Please, God, please don't hurt them. They're not themselves. They need to get out of here. Adira silently begged, though she knew she could be hurt. God merely made his way past her, as if dismissing what she had said entirely. Annoyed, she was about to open her mouth once more, when a large claw flew to her lips, covering her face entirely. God shushed her, sniffing the air as if something was wrong. His great horned head looked around them like a deer, aware of some unknown, unwanted presence. Adira was now terrified, wondering what it was that made the terrifying beast before her so worried. After what seemed like forever, he let go and acted as if nothing was wrong.
Your friends aren't themselves, you say? No surprise. This forest can do things to you.
Adira furrowed her eyebrows, shaking her head in confusion. Wait, stop! What was all that about? God stared at her with a blank expression, as if wondering what she was talking about. He didn't respond, and instead waited for her to lead the way. His companion wouldn't forget that moment, and would have pushed for a response had it not been for more pressing matters. She motioned for him to follow, and warned him repeatedly to not be himself around the men. If anything happened, or if they were scared, he would have to leave immediately. God, of course, wasn't going to, and wanted to inflict terror, but he pretended he would do as she said. Adira felt her stomach start to bubble with nervous gas as she inched closer to the sheltered camp. God examined their surroundings, wondering how he had never seen the place before. As the woman rounded a corner, she began to announce her arrival. Kevin, Conrad, I brought help. Please don't freak out or anything. He's a friend. To her surprise, no one was there. The fire pit was completely out and cold. The tents were gone, and even the damaged cabin's door swayed slightly with the wind. It was as if no one had been there in ages. Despite how run down it was before, Adira could feel the aura of emptiness radiating from the place. God noticed it also, sniffing the floor as he crawled towards the camp. He examined each area, glancing at Adira's upset face every now and then. The beast even went so far as to peek inside the isolated cabin. Once he was done, he made his way to Adira with a shake of his head.
There's no one here.
Maybe they left. I knew I shouldn't have.
You don't get it.
God cut her off.
I can't smell anything. No one has been here in a long time.
Chapter 24. Shadows in the Dark. Adira narrowed her eyes, shaking her head furiously. You're not smelling hard enough, or you're lying. Don't even say I got the place wrong, because this is where I slept last night. She pointed to an empty area next to the fire pit, while God casually inspected an old bag laying to one side. He peeked inside, then tossed it with little interest.
Nothing but rot here. You smell of death as well.
I don't care what I smell like. They probably got scared and left, and cleaned up their tracks or something. Adira yanked Kevin's knife out and showed it to God, who stared at the item for ages. Smell it and find them, please. God plucked the knife from her small grasp and inspected it closely. He growled as he looked it over, then glanced back at Adira.
What did you say your friends' names were?
Kevin and Conrad. That's Kevin's knife. Mitch gave it to him a while back. Adira felt horrible, knowing that the one thing Kevin had of Mitch was gone from him. She had to hurry and find out where the two men were so she could give it back.
Smells like death.
God immediately tossed the knife back to the woman.
You reek of it also. I noticed it when you first came back to me.
Adira didn't know what God was talking about. She was at the point of giving up entirely and finding them on her own, when he abruptly grabbed her and tossed her over his shoulder. She was too caught off guard to speak for a moment, but managed to find her voice. Excuse me?
I smell something faint here. There are tracks belonging to something large. It's a singular individual, not two. Don't complain about me carrying you, because your little legs won't make it far.
Adira stayed quiet, thinking about what Kevin had told her the night before, as well as her dream. She bit inside of her cheek, picking away at the dead skin. Hunting season. Hey, I have something to ask you.
What is it?
Kevin told me it's hunting season, but not for us. He also said he's seen you from time to time. Maybe you've seen him around. God stepped over a large stream, wiggling his boot to get the excess water out. He readjusted Adira to a more comfortable position, sitting her on his shoulder now. She instinctively reached out for his horns to steady herself, fearful yet amazed at how he felt. He was cold, smooth, and radiated some unpleasant energy. Now that she got a closer look at his head, she could tell it was thick and sturdy, like bone. The darkness of his skin did not change, however, and she could barely make out any features despite being so close.
I would have known if I was being watched by a human,
God responded, pretending to sleep on something just so Adira would grab him tighter.
Hunting season? Well, I suppose it is. I'm an expert huntsman.
The blonde-haired woman said nothing as she watched their surroundings. Steady streams of light were now penetrating through trees and fog. Even the rain had subsided, leaving behind the smell of wet leaves. Had it not been for the events that had unfolded, Adira would have greatly enjoyed the view.
Your people back at camp have marked you as missing. You've worried them all.
Huh? Oh, I don't really care anymore. I have more important things to do. God was pleased with her response, and the two stayed in silence as he quickly traveled over large distances. He was right, Adira thought. Wherever they were headed would have worn her out completely had she been walking the entire time.
Tell me about yourself, Adira,
God suddenly said, causing the woman to raise her brows in surprise. Her name had never been spoken by him before. It felt strange. I don't know what to say. Why do you ask?
I'm curious.
Okay. Adira glanced away from the beast and stared out into the greenery, watching a few birds pass by them with little chirps. Well, my favorite color is pink. I like to play video games and eat sushi. Happy?
You're very boring,
God stated with dissatisfaction.
What scares you?
You do.
I take it as a compliment.
Adira rolled her eyes, pushing one of his horns aside as it jabbed her cheek. Oh yeah? I have a question for you now. God lifted his head slightly as Adira rested her small hand on the top of his skull. She clicked her tongue in satisfaction once she came up with a proper question to ask the beast. What in the living hell are you?
Huh.
Adira couldn't help but let out a weird, confused snort at how funny God sounded. It was only when she was reminded of everything in the past did she compose herself and wipe the grin off her lips. You heard me. You're not human. You look like a shadow person. You eat people and you're freakishly tall. But you act like one of us. What are you? God was silent, causing Adira to think he was annoyed. It was only after he stopped walking and began muttering to himself did she realize something else was going on. Forget I asked. She broke the awkward silence, only to be met with a very cold response.
I come from somewhere far away. I don't want to talk about it.
Almost instantly, he grabbed Adira by the waist and plopped her back down on the floor.
You can walk from here.
The woman was grateful to be on the floor once again, though she felt off with the unusual exchange. Something had upset him, But there were other things to worry about at the moment. She continued trailing behind him for the remainder of their walk, only to run into his leg when he came to a sudden halt. She didn't say a word, and glanced upwards to see what had grabbed God's attention. He seemed to be entranced by a certain sight before him, and it was only when she followed his gaze did she finally speak. "Oh, fuck!" Before them was what could only be described as a sea of bodies dangling from trees overhead. Their entrails were securely fastened on various branches, like ornaments carefully arranged on a Christmas tree.
Well, I suppose your little friend was right. It's definitely hunting season. Only I'm not the only one participating.
Chapter 25. Silence. Adira chewed on her thumb, peeling away skin and spitting it out of her mouth. She had to leave the scene of death immediately, seeking recluse underneath a small tree. There she sat until God found her about an hour or so after. He was going to scare her, but could sense her reaction wouldn't be as satisfying.
It's finished. None of them looked like your friends.
He reached into his pocket and felt for Adira's tiny phone. God had spent a good while staring at her wallpaper, digesting every detail of the men's faces for hours on, and since she had left it with him. Adira turned her head backwards, revealing scared, doe-like eyes. She noticed God had her phone in his hand, outstretched towards her. She took it and stuffed it into her pocket without a word.
I know what you're thinking. There's something else out there. Perhaps there is, but I can't sense them. Not yet, at least.
The human rested her forehead on her knees, sighing deeply as she closed her eyes in exhaustion. I just found them, and now they're gone again. I'm further away from Mitch than I've ever been. God wondered if the woman was starting to grow delusional. The place she had led them to before was deserted and had been for ages. There was a slight trail, but it vanished halfway through their journey. The only way he was led to the massacre was due to the scent of decay traveling with the wind. What's going on? I thought you were the god of the forest. How can you not know who's doing this? God didn't have an answer. Whoever or whatever was behind the murders was purposefully trying to hide their tracks from him, while also letting him know they were there. For what purpose?
No use thinking about it. It's best if you go back to your people for now, until I get to the bottom of this.
Adira lifted her head, standing up with an objection at the tip of her tongue. God noticed this and cut her off before the words could spill from her mouth.
Or you can stay with me. You will have to do whatever I say, whenever I say.
God offered his hand to the woman, and she slowly took it, adding in her end of the bargain. Fine, but we are going to find Kevin and Conrad also, not just whoever's killing people. And also Mitch. Mitch is my top priority. God could roll his eyes, but refrained from doing so. He helped the woman up and examined her from head to toe. She was covered in dirt, smelled odd, and lacked proper nutrition.
"There's a lake down there. I suggest you throw yourself in it. I'll get you better clothes and some food."
Adira was insulted. She sneakily smelled her underarms as God turned his back to her, leaving her alone without another word. With nothing else to do, Adira had no other choice but to throw herself in the pools. The path God had instructed her to take was short, and indeed did lead to a somewhat deep body of water. Adira stared out at the cool surface, reminiscing of what had happened yesterday when she tried to take her life. To be back in the same place that nearly ended her existence was anxiety-inducing. But a bath was a bath. She would only go hip deep. Adira slipped off her shirt, gently taking out the necklace in her pocket and laying it aside before tossing her shorts on the floor as well. The water was cold, but she managed to ignore the uncomfortable sensation long enough to sink until her waist was submerged. As she quickly splashed her shivering body and poured water over her head, something lurked in the shadows. It was God. He was resting against a tree bark, his arms crossed over his chest as he silently observed the woman. The drops of water rolling from her hair sent small ripples around her, like she was a goddess emerging from the waves. God was even more impressed to find that her bruises weren't as prominent as before. Even her leg, which he bit into, was nothing more than a small scar. He was sure she didn't even notice how fast her body was healing. It was a gift from the forest, and in a way, a gift from him to her. Adira quickly peered back to shore to make sure she wasn't being watched. Once she felt secure, she stepped out of the waters and put her old clothes back on, unaware of the monster. God sighed heavily, glancing down at the floor. He shifted uncomfortable, readjusting his jacket before heading out, and actually doing what he planned to do. In the meantime, Adira tried to get together a cozy little camp for herself. She gathered twigs, leaves, and branches. Even a few berries popped up, red, juicy, and bouncy to the touch. She used the end of her shirt as a basket and managed to pick out a few until a spider appeared out of nowhere. That marked the end of her short-lived adventure. By the time Adira got back to her camp, God was already there. On the ground, next to a freshly lit fireplace, lay a pile of what Adira noticed was meat, ripped in pieces and ready for cooking. She mentally took note that God would have the ones at the very bottom. That was quick. She managed to crack a small smile, still wary and a little uncomfortable about spending some time with the beast. He didn't say anything, merely stabbed a fresh chunk of meat with a sharp stick and hovered it over the fire. Adira sat opposite of him and did the same. As she seated herself, God tossed her a bag of what she could only assume was clothes.
"Everything here is stolen from a certain family. Enjoy."
He sat up, grabbing the barely cooked meat that still dripped with blood, and hovered it over his face. Out of nowhere, a large pointy teeth and a long tongue appeared, causing Adira to almost drop her stick. As soon as his mouth was exposed, it was gone. shielded by the shadows once more. "Where are you going?"
"Patrolling,"
was all God responded with, before facing his back towards her and walking out into the forest. Things felt off, Adira wondered, as her eyes licked up the sight of the flames. She twirled the stick in her fingers, losing interest as she jabbed it into the ground. A side glance at the bag God had given her piqued her interest. She carefully yanked it from the floor and rested on her lap, rummaging inside. There were different types of clothes and pants, all seemingly belonging to a singular individual. Cozy, yet stylish and chic. Adira wanted to try on a sweater, until one in particular caught her attention. She narrowed her eyes, jaw falling slightly as she slipped out a familiar lilac-colored hoodie. Where had she seen it before? Of course, Adira whispered to herself, remembering the sleepover her and the particular woman were supposed to have. She wore the exact same sweater the night God chased them down. The others back at camp said she got up and left, but now Adira thought otherwise. Holding the jacket close to her, the woman got up and looked around for any sign of God. She had to question him and asked what he had done to Devon. If anything happened to her, Adira was sure to never forgive him. Thank you for listening to Hunting Season by Dr. Rockhard. If you enjoyed the story, please leave a thumbs up, as it helps to grow the channel.